Good afternoon and welcome everybody to the Stony Brook University College of Arts and Sciences preview session. I'm Amanda Mills, Assistant Director of Admissions for Stony Brook. I have a few notes before we begin. First, please use the Q&A feature to ask our speaker any questions and we will answer them at the end of the session. Second, note that this session is being recorded and will be available on the admissions YouTube page soon. And lastly, there are a variety of topics that will be covered during the next few days, and we encourage you to join us for all that interest you. And now, please join me in welcoming our presenter, Gregory Ruf, Associate Professor and Graduate Program Director in Asian and Asian American Studies at Stony Brook.
Well, thank you very much, Amanda, and welcome, everyone. I'm going to share my screen here. And hopefully follow along without mishap. There we go. Well, as Amanda said, my name's Greg Ruf, and I'm a sociocultural anthropologist and historian in the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies, where I currently serve as Graduate Program Director. I've been at Stony Brook since 1995, and over the last quarter century, I've been affiliated with more than a half dozen different departments and programs here. I thought I would talk a little bit about my background, how I got involved in doing what I do, what it is that I do, and what it's like to do what I do. And please feel free to ask me anything during our brief time together here. I've been traveling to and around China for 40 years. Many people ask me, as a white guy from upstate New York, what got me interested in China? And I wish I could give you a thoughtful and erudite answer, something about commitment to promoting international goodwill and friendship, or about the foresight to see China's emergence one day as a major global power, or the sagacity to develop critical skills to help me succeed in a competitive global job market. But the truth of the matter is something far more mundane. I grew up near Binghamton, New York, and I knew from a fairly young age that I did not want to spend the rest of my life in Binghamton, New York. And to me, China seemed to be about as far away as I could go without starting to get closer again to home. As a youth, I spent a fair amount of time in our basement where my father kept a globe and a massive collection of National Geographic magazines. And I would spin the globe and stop it with pressure from my finger, and then go and look up an article about that place and peruse the pictures. By the time I was a teenager, I had traveled much of the world vicariously. And even today, I'm pretty good at world geography trivia. I went to college at SUNY Cortland in central New York, not too far from home, where I began my undergraduate studies as a psychology major, hoping one day to go into counseling. Belatedly, I discovered that the psych program there at the time specialized in experimental research involving electrical stimulation to the brains of lab animals, something that I had decidedly little interest in pursuing. So I changed my major to communications. But then I discovered that that wasn't really about what I thought it was about. So I changed my major again, this time to political science. I was not particularly interested in domestic US politics, but rather something broader, more global, like international relations, or as I like to think about it back then as a 19-year-old, international affairs. My parents approved about the international part, not so much about the affairs part. And much to his credit, my father encouraged me to study whatever I was interested in studying, so that my job, my career would be engaging, personally meaningful, and hopefully enjoyable. Do something where you wake up eager to go to work, he told me. My father was an electrical engineer who designed flight simulator computers, but he had really wanted to be a forest ranger, and he always seemed to regret his choice of career path. My mother, for her part, envisioned me becoming a diplomat one day, and assured me that she would come visit me if I were posted to places like London, Paris, or Vienna. So when my junior year came around, I signed up for study abroad. And since I'm being honest, let me say that China was not my first choice. I was hoping to go to Europe, but I lacked the requisite foreign language credits to qualify for a program in French, German, or Spanish. And there was a 2-year wait list to study abroad in London. The only option remaining was a new exchange program with a small teachers' college in Beijing, China. The program was not exactly popular with students at Cortland, or for that matter, with their parents. But there was also no Chinese language proficiency requirement, and they eliminated all the program fees to encourage students to apply. They got one applicant, me. Be careful what you wish for, they say. Off I went to the far side of the world, a naive and impressionable American 20-year-old who had no idea what he was getting himself into. I knew nothing about China other than where to find it on a map. And when I arrived, I could speak only 5 words of Chinese. 我是美国人, I am an American. And I could not read a single Chinese character. But by the end of my first day, I had learned to recognize 2 Chinese characters, male and female. I felt I was off to a good start. At least I knew where to find the toilet. That first year in China, back in 1982, was an eye-opening, mind-blowing, life-changing experience for me. Chairman Mao had died only a few years earlier, and China was in the early stages of the post-Mao reforms. I was among the second cohort, the RP, of American students permitted to study in China. Very few people there spoke English. Russian had been the primary foreign language of study. And this was an immersive cultural experience. You had to use Chinese wherever you went, regardless of how poorly you spoke, because there really was no other way to communicate with people. It was a real challenge at first. I didn't even understand what my homework assignments were. In fact, I didn't even know how to say the word homework. But you learn to cope. You learn tenacity. You learn resilience. You learn to gain confidence in your ability to overcome challenges, to solve problems, and to adapt to unexpected and changing circumstances. I urge all my students to embark on a study abroad experience during their time in college. Too many of us think about study abroad as some kind of indulgence, but it could be the single most significant thing you do as an undergraduate. Think of it not as an expense, but rather as an investment, something that may reward you with huge dividends in the future. Here at Stony Brook, I teach a variety of classes on Chinese history, culture, and society. This is an entry-level class, an introduction to major historical dynasties, imperial administration, family and kinship, trade routes, cultural exchange, philosophy and religion, festivals and food, arts and architecture, science and technology. My environmental history class is an upper division course cross-listed with the history department. And that one explores the interaction between human activities and the natural environment, focusing on political ecology and the relationships between cultural ideas, behavioral practices, human health, and environmental change. My course on ancient China is offered online in the summer, and it explores the development of social, economic, political, and cultural systems in ancient China, from the Neolithic period through the Han Dynasty, drawing on archaeological data and historical texts to examine the emergence of state-level polities and their subsequent unification under imperial authority. My kinship course is cross-listed with anthropology, and examines the forms and dynamics of social organization in Chinese society. We spend a lot of time exploring how gender and generation, ancestry and descent, and patterns of ritualized exchange shape identity, status, and power. I also have a course on cultural diversity in China, also cross-listed with anthropology. And this one explores issues of ethnic and national identity, both past and present, focusing on the material and social relationships that have shaped perceptions of and interactions between various cultural groups in China, especially ethnic minorities who inhabit the country's frontier border regions. Our departmental pro seminar on research design is the only course I teach that does not focus on China. And this is a required capstone seminar for graduating seniors. It introduces students to the qualitative and quantitative research methods commonly used in social sciences and humanities. Participants design a research project on a topic of their own choice and develop a detailed plan of action to pursue during supervised research in their final semester at the university. So as you can see, I don't teach Chinese language classes, but I always endeavor to introduce some key Chinese terms in the courses that I do teach. At very least, I hope this inspires my students to learn more Chinese. At a deeper level, I hope it helps my students to understand how concepts in another language create different frames of reference, shape cognition and understanding in different ways, and express meaning with subtle nuances. One common example I regularly use in the Chinese kinship course entails the word for family, jia. This character consists of two elements, a radical mian, meaning roof, under which is shi, a literary term for pig, hog, or swine. The pig under the roof motif conveys the notion of domesticated animals and the more abstract idea of family as fundamentally an economic unit. Another example of the cognitive contrast between English and Chinese concerns the word population. Now, English speakers simply learn to memorize the word, and few probably appreciate its 16th century derivation from the Latin populus, meaning people. Now, in Chinese, the word for population is 人口, literally person, mouth. Boom, there it is, right in front of you. If you have people, if you have a population, they must be fed. And to me, that's a very different way of thinking about things. When you ask somebody how many people are in their family, you ask, 你家有几口人? How many people mouths are in your family? Now, in that example, mouth, 口, is a classifier or measure word for the noun people. Chinese language contains more than 100 of these measure words or classifiers, referred to as 量词. These grammatical elements are used before every noun when specifying a particular quantity. We have them in English too, just not so many of them. A loaf of bread, a herd of horses, a school of fish, a cup of coffee. But in Chinese, every quantified noun is preceded by a classifier. The pattern is number, followed by classifier, followed by the noun. For example, flat objects, such as tables, beds, paper, share the classifier 张. So you have 1 zhang paper, 2 zhang tables, 3 zhang beds. Cylindrical objects, on the other hand, share a different classifier. 支. You have 4 zhi pens, 5 zhi pencils, 6 zhi branches, 7 zhi chopsticks, 8 zhi rifles. So when you learn a new noun, you also need to learn the appropriate measure word. And what interests me about these classifiers in Chinese is that these grammatical elements highlight different ways of ordering the world, different modes of perception, different frames of interpretation. There's also a sort of generic or universal measure word, ge, which can be used as a substitute if you can't remember the proper classifier. Many beginning learners of Chinese fall back on the ubiquitous ge. People will understand what you're trying to say, but they'll also understand that your command of Chinese is rather poor. Another intriguing aspect of Chinese language are the multitude of proverbs or idiomatic expressions, often consisting of 4 characters known as chengyu, literally became speech. There are about 5,000 of these chengyu in contemporary common usage, although some dictionaries list upwards of 20,000. They are widely regarded as linguistic repositories of the collective wisdom of Chinese culture, expressing moral concepts and admonishments often derived from ancient texts. Consider, for example, the idiomatic expression 破釜沉舟, to break the cauldrons and sink the boats, meaning to commit irrevocably to something, no turning back. Now, this idiomatic expression is based on a historical account of the Battle of Zhulu in 207 BCE, when the famous General Xiang Yu ordered his troops to destroy all the cooking vessels and the boats after crossing a river into the enemy's territory, thus committing his forces to victory by depriving them of any retreat. In fact, for those who think the study of ancient Chinese classics has little or no bearing on contemporary American life and society, consider some of these idiomatic expressions that seem to have a direct and immediate relevance for certain recent events. 井底之蛙, frog at the bottom of a well, meaning a person with limited knowledge or outlook. Or 指鹿为马, to point at a deer and call it a horse, or to misinterpret or misrepresent something deliberately. Or 三人成虎, 3 men make a tiger, or referring to the tendency to accept absurd information or groundless rumor simply if it's repeated enough times by enough people. As George Santayana warned, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Another fun thing about Chinese is that compared to English, spoken Chinese has much more limited number of sound combinations, and consequently, Chinese is a language with a good many homophones, words with similar sounds but different meanings. It's also a tonal language, so the same sounds with different tonal inflections can have very different meanings. Ma means mother. Ma means hemp. Ma means horse. And ma means to curse, swear, or scold somebody. Now, honestly, this is one of the things that makes learning Chinese so challenging, but also so rewarding. There are sometimes layers of meaning in seemingly innocuous sentences. As a beginner learner of Chinese living in Beijing, my schoolmates pranked me by urging me to ask my teacher if we could go on an outing to the Beijing Zoo to see the grass mud horse, which, when you say that in Chinese, sounds very much like a crude expression concerning one's mother. When I first started working in China, one sometimes faced protracted delays of weeks or even months before authorities responded to a request for access to some archival document or for permission to visit a local temple. We still need to research. 研究 your request was a common refrain. But Yanjiu research is a homophone for Yanjiu, tobacco and alcohol. And those in the know understood very well that this was code for we are still waiting for gifts of tobacco and alcohol before we act on your request. So what about my research? Well, my work is situated at the intersections of culture and history. I'm particularly interested in the changing social and economic relationships between rural and urban areas in China over the last century or so. Now, for the last 30 years, I've been engaged in a long-term longitudinal study of a rural market town in Sichuan province, an ongoing project that explores issues in rural development, property rights, resource management, community organization, and local elite succession. As a socio-cultural anthropologist, my research entails a considerable amount of field work, living in the Chinese countryside and sharing in the lives of the people there, often for periods of several months or upwards of a year at a time. This often affords opportunities to see and hear things that might otherwise escape the attention of more short-term visitors or researchers who choose to stay in the relative comfort of city hotels with modern amenities and make only short day trips to the countryside. Ethnographers, such as myself, who study local society, culture, and history, typically learn to communicate in the vernacular language of our research subjects. This frees us from reliance on translators who, intentionally or not, may misrepresent, misinterpret, or simply edit discursive exchanges. Moreover, being able to speak, read, and write Chinese with relative fluency helps to establish stronger rapport. And learning to communicate in local spoken dialects earns one respect while facilitating the cultivation of interpersonal relationships and even friendships, which can be so important in the sort of research work that I do. But what may be good for my own research agenda is not always good for the academic programs with which I have been affiliated. When I was first hired at Stony Brook back in 1995, the head of China studies at the time told me not to speak Chinese with our students because I carried such a strong Sichuan accent. She wanted students to be exposed only to proper standard Mandarin pronunciation. In the field, however, speaking like a central television news broadcaster can be counterproductive. For some locals, such stylized inflections are associated with Beijing and officialdom and tend to generate a degree of social distance between speakers and local audiences. In essence, you come across as sounding a bit too formal or too much like an arrogant urban intellectual. In my line of research work, I find it preferable to speak in Tuhua, or the local vernacular dialect, the speech of the earth. People are demonstrably enamored, warmly welcoming, and even more forthcoming when I use local slang or patois. The importance of all this at a practical level was made evident to me during one of my first interviews in rural Sichuan, when I was still relying on my command of standard Mandarin Chinese. An elderly woman was telling me about interpersonal conflicts with her son and daughter-in-law. And as she began to recount, quite emotionally, the physical abuse she had suffered at their hands, she code switched into a strong local dialect that I could not understand. After the interview, I asked the local research assistant assigned to me what she had said, and he demurred. Until you've been here long enough to understand yourself, what she said, you don't deserve to know. That was some of the most solid advice I had ever received. In terms of methods, my research entails something referred to as participant observation, where the field researcher lives among one's research subjects, not only observing behavioral interactions, but also actively participating in the social and economic activities of local life. This can include attending weddings and funerals and ritual celebrations at religious temples, as well as things like going to market, helping with the harvest, joining family excursions, or sometimes just hanging out together. When, as a graduate student, I first went off on a year-long stint of field research in China, my faculty advisor insisted that each day I should conduct what he called an ethnographic patrol, a daily routine that entailed walking around the local community, observing and greeting people, and helping them get accustomed to my presence. See and be seen, he advised me. And I have to say, it made a difference. It also better attuned me to some of the subtle changes that might otherwise escape notice. There are, of course, formal interviews that follow a fixed series of questions covering various topics, and which are usually conducted at private homes where respondents feel more comfortable and at ease. I rarely use audio or video recording devices. Not only does such equipment tend to make people feel uncomfortable and even hyper-conscious about what they say, but such recordings may compromise the confidentiality of interviews if they fall into the wrong hands. So usually I use only a pocket notebook and a pen. People may be put off at first when you write down everything they say, but over time, most grow accustomed to my note-taking and sometimes even insist that I write down something in particular they wish to emphasize. My research methods also involve survey questionnaires and other statistical instruments designed to collect quantitative data about economic activities, betrothal and marriage, gift exchanges, even home renovations. Conducting formal surveys of public opinion in China, however, is a politically sensitive activity and one that has been prohibited by authorities. Nonetheless, there's a good deal of quality information that may be gleaned even from informal conversations with no set agenda, such as those that take place in tea houses on market day. Sometimes the natural flow of spontaneous conversation can yield valuable insights, including on public opinion, while remaining below the radar of government authorities. My research also entails collecting life histories from individual respondents and using personal biography to understand the major events that have shaped people's lives and influenced their actions, their values, and their points of view. Now, these may be subsequently aggregated into family histories, offering insight on the organization and management of different domestic groups across time. I myself am a bit of a visual learner, so I typically also conduct family genealogical reconstructions, diagramming family trees and adding annotations regarding key information. And finally, I attempt to cross-check and broaden my database through archival research to whatever extent possible. Now, for me, this has proven rather challenging in the area of China in which I work, as government authorities have granted me only very limited access to historical documents, economic statistics, demographic data, and other official publications. Local authorities even denied me access to the village household registry until permission reportedly came down from the State Council of the central government in Beijing. I've learned through the years to appreciate the adage, where there is no door, there's a window. And Chinese colleagues working on similar research themes have sometimes assisted me in obtaining photocopies of openly published, non-classified materials that government authorities denied me access to. There are, of course, some particular challenges rather unique to conducting this sort of research work in China. My activities are closely monitored by authorities, and I am not always free to go wherever I want to go, or do whatever I want to do, or talk to whoever I want to talk to, or ask about whatever I want to ask about. You cannot conduct independent anthropological fieldwork in China, but rather you must collaborate with Chinese colleagues who officially invite you to apply for a research visa on a joint project, and then serve as your in-country hosts and sponsors responsible for your conduct and your safety. Your research proposal must be vetted and approved by various levels of the Chinese government, and authorities select for you a particular field site that they deem appropriate to your research. You're also typically required to hire a research assistant who also serves as a minder, accompanying you on all your research activities and reporting back each day to local authorities regarding what you did, where you went, who you spoke with, and what they said to you. Now, when I first started working in Sichuan, the research assistant assigned to me was a retired village party cadre, former head of local security and PLA veteran who had fought the Americans during the Korean War. Although we eventually developed a very warm and genuine personal relationship, the relationship was a bit tense at the outset. The only time I was alone was when I went to the latrine or when I went to bed. And during the very first interview I conducted, an elderly farmer was recalling his experiences having served in a reform through labor prison camp after the Communist Revolution in 1949. And my assistant, who was sitting with us listening, reached out and struck the old man over the head with a stick. "Don't talk about those things," he rebuked the old man. Now, over the last 40 years, I've had a rewarding and fulfilling career as a student of Chinese language, culture, society, and history. And much of that journey of discovery has been off the beaten path, so to speak. And along the way, I've encountered and endured no small amount of official wariness or mistrust about my activities, and even active interference with my research work, or what is sometimes called making someone wear small shoes. To be fair, I sort of understand. A foreigner, particularly an American, going around China, carrying a notebook and a camera, speaking near fluent Chinese and talking to all sorts of people from all walks of life can seem a little odd, if not suspicious. Now, to compound matters, students in China who demonstrate unusual aptitude in foreign languages are often recruited to attend the University of International Relations in Beijing, which is controlled by the Ministry of Public Security and is known for training intelligence agents. Consequently, as a foreigner, the better you speak Chinese, the more suspicious authorities are or may be about you. On several occasions, I've been questioned by authorities about my motives, demanding ever so politely to know who I really work for. In fact, just a few years ago, I was detained and interrogated for several hours after photographing information displayed on public bulletin boards, ironically known as open boards. 2 carloads of public security officers came from the county seat and questioned me with video recording and still photography about why I was there and what I was really doing. The tricky thing about such suspicions is that the more vociferously you try to refute them, the more some officials suspect you are hiding something. Look, when someone asks you, either in earnest or in jest, whether you're a spy, there's really no good response you can offer. You're damned if you deny such accusations, and you're equally damned if you don't deny them. I've had local officials attempt to physically pull my notebook out of my hand to examine its contents, which prompted me subsequently to record field notes in a deliberately near illegible scrawl that only I can decipher. I've had my belongings searched while I was out of my room, and don't get me started on the myriad of problems I experienced with my cell phone in China. In fact, on my last trip to China, which was a tourist visit, a 6-week self-guided tour with my wife and stepchildren, I was the only member of our party of 4 who could never connect to a VPN service. Just a coincidence, I'm sure. During field research, authorities imposed certain restrictions on my activities and movements, imposing what they referred to as a stipulated scope or a guiding fanway for my research, and effectively confining me to one particular village field site. Once, when I was attempting to accompany a bridal procession to a home in a neighboring village, local authorities stopped me at the village border and told me I could not proceed to the groom's home, which was clearly visible just 50 meters ahead. That is outside the stipulated parameters of your research, I was told. On another occasion, repeated requests to visit an irrigation pumping station a few kilometers up the road, which many villagers had proudly recalled helping to build during the Great Leap Forward, were rebuffed for months. Eventually, arrangements were approved for the son of the township militia chief to escort me there on his motorcycle. But on the way back, he pulled off the road, stopped, and asked me to sell him American dollars at a 1-to-1 exchange rate. During the first Gulf War in 1990-91, I took a month-long break from my field research to visit my wife and infant son at home. And upon my return to China, I discovered that local authorities had grown suspicious about the timing and circumstances of my absence, suspecting that I was actually a member of the US military who had been called up to serve in the conflict. "You fought beautifully," the village party secretary congratulated me. On other occasions, the sentiments expressed have been less affirming. In 1999, after American missiles struck the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the Balkan Wars, local authorities organized a patriotic anti-American demonstration in the rural market town where I was conducting research, and urged local residents to keep their distance from me and to decline interviews. Now, it's important to note that such prejudices and xenophobia are not confined to China. We've seen plenty of that here in the US as well. It's hurtful when anyone frames their interaction with you solely through the template of race, ethnicity, or gender. A little more than a decade ago, when I was serving as Director of Chinese Studies here at Stony Brook, a colleague in another department wrote to me voicing her misgivings about me serving in such a capacity. "It's nothing personal," she assured me. "I voted to hire you, but a white male should never be in a position of authority over Asian females. That only serves to reproduce the structural inequalities of European imperialism and colonialism." When my department chair at the time declined to support me in the matter and told me to keep quiet about the incident, I decided to take a leave of absence, and I spent a couple of years as a visiting professor at Wellesley College. There's a well-known proverb associated with Lord Mengchang, an aristocrat from the state of Qi in the Warring States period of ancient Chinese history. "Jiao tu san ku," a crafty rabbit has 3 burrows, and one should always have more than one plan to fall back upon. I've had the time of my life studying China. It's been a lifelong process of experiential learning that has helped me grow in ways I had never imagined. right? Led me to see and interpret the world in novel and different ways, and prepared me to cope with unforeseen challenges and to adapt to changing circumstances. It's up to each of you to choose your own paths to walk in life. But if your personal journey brings you to Stony Brook, I want you to know that you are most welcome in my classroom, whomever you are, wherever you're from, and whatever your interests may be. Now, before I conclude, please permit me to offer a few suggestions regarding your time in college. Once a year, if not once each semester, take one course purely for your own interest and enjoyment, something you personally want to learn more about. Consider it your reward for all the other courses you will be required to take for your major field of study. And shop around for the right major. Prospective employers really don't care so much about your major in college. What they care about is demonstrable evidence of your ability to learn quickly and successfully. They will teach you what they feel you need to know to work for them. They seek talent that can think outside the box, people who bring a diversity of skills and viewpoints to the workforce. I know a senior vice president of a large commercial bank in Boston, someone who moved into finance after working many years as an elementary school teacher. My own students have pursued careers in a variety of fields, including law, diplomacy, public administration, medicine, social work, academia, business, life sciences, journalism, and nonprofit organizations. And think too about pursuing an academic minor. If you don't finish the minor, there's no record of it on your academic transcript. But declaring a minor might give you priority registration for certain courses. And you'll find that different departments and programs at Stony Brook have their own character and vibe. I've been here nearly 30 years, and I must say, in all honesty, that the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies is one of the most supportive, most caring, and most family-like communities on campus. Search around for something that fits you and your needs. And don't be afraid to try something new. Go far beyond your comfort zone. You'll be hard-pressed in life to find a more supportive learning environment. Don't be afraid to fail, but learn from your mistakes. Learn to fail up. Success is great, but it can breed hubris and conceit. Failure is humbling, but it can inspire you to redouble your effort and to attain new heights. You are capable of accomplishing so much more than you think you're capable of accomplishing. Learn to teach yourself. On the surface, the courses you take are about particular subject matter, but at a deeper level, they're really about learning to think in new ways, learning to use new ideas and new techniques to frame analysis and interpretation. Focus on developing your own analytical skill set. And speak up in class. Don't be afraid. It's a safe space. Don't settle into a passive mode as a wallflower. You might get through class without ever being called upon to speak. But if that's your goal, then I urge you to reconsider attending college. You're going to be wasting your time and your money. And another thing I've learned at Stony Brook is that squeaky wheels get the grease. This is a wonderful institution, full of helpful people and incredible resources, but you need to take the initiative to find them, to seek out assistance and advice. We tend to think about culture as something empowering, a uniquely human capacity that sets us apart from the animals, that enables humans to gain dominion over the world. But culture can also be confining and fettering. It teaches us to see the world in one way and not another. In a sense, culture can be like the blinders they put on mules and horses, restricting their peripheral vision, keeping them focused on task. I submit to you that your goal in college should be to free yourself of your own cultural blinders. Learn that there are other ways to see the world, other paths to travel. As the Taoist Lao Tzu says, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. I look forward to seeing you here in person at Stony Brook as you start your own journey of discovery. So be well, do good, take care, live long and prosper. I thank you for your time and attention today. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Ruff. That was truly a fascinating and informative presentation. I don't see any questions that came in, but we hope that everyone stays safe, be well, and thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Take care.